Hello, everybody. We've got some great content coming at you from Free Speech Media Network here tonight. But first, we're going to give a little bit of love to some of our sponsors for today's shows. First up being Blood of Tyrants Wine. If you are looking for a nice night in while also sipping on the blood of your tyrannical enemies and supporting the destruction of the state, look no further than Blood of Tyrants Wine. A nice Merlot distributed by activists you know and love. Bloodoftyrants.wine is the place to go. Use promo code FSM to get 10% off of your first order. Again, that's bloodoftyrants.wine and use promo code FSM to get 10% off your first order. Go on over and check them out today. Our next sponsor is Crafton Business Services. Crafton is dedicated to helping entrepreneurs start, grow, and maintain their businesses by providing a wide variety of products and services to make your business more efficient, manageable, and profitable. And Crafton understands how frustrating getting your business off the ground can be, and that's why they've put together their business in a box solutions to turn your idea or side hustle into a fully functioning company in one place for one transparent cost. So for under $1,000, you get your corporate filing, your registered agent, your logo, business cards, a marketing strategy, and an accounting consultation to get you started off on the right foot. All of that is just $9.99 plus state theft. And if you're looking for a little bit more than that, you can add a custom website, web hosting, more marketing material, more time with our marketing team, 5 times the bookkeeping services, and your first box of business cards, all for $24.99, again, plus state theft. And if you already have a business, Crafton can help you grow to new levels with targeted marketing campaigns, affiliate programs, website and social media redesigns, and more. Or help make your business less of a headache with streamlined accounting, tax prep, and compliance. No matter what you're doing or what your needs are, Crafton Business Services probably has something that can help you out. So go on over to crafton.us to learn more. Use promo code FSM to help support the network and show them some love. We've got Living in the Logos coming at you here in the next couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
All right. We should be live if the computer is being honest. And thank you for being here. If you are here, I appreciate your time. I know it's a valuable thing. This is Living in the Logos. My name is Ryan Tower, and we're going to be talking tonight about the Bible, which is probably one of the most read books in the world. And I think even in the West, if you're approaching the Bible from a secular point of view or even an atheist point of view, I think it's right that we would acknowledge the significance that the Bible has had on Western thought as a whole, both the philosophical tradition and just the tradition of ideas in general. And so we're going to be talking about what the Bible actually is. And in order to know what something is, you have to know what the thing is for. And that's a really important aspect that we're going to be talking about a little more in depth. But I want to read you a quote to start off with. And the quote is from C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, if you don't know who he is, he's a Christian apologist who was an atheist and was converted from atheism to Christianity. And he's a very well-known writer, somebody who communicates and articulates very well the Christian worldview. And he was also savvy in terms of literature and philosophy. Definitely worth a read if you're interested in Christianity, or if you just want to know a little bit more about what Christians believe. C.S. Lewis is a great place to begin. And the quote is relevant to what we're going to do tonight, and I want you to listen carefully. The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, what it was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used. The first thing is to understand the object before you. As long as you think a corkscrew was meant for opening cans or a cathedral for entertaining tourists, you can say nothing about their purpose. And I hope it's apparent why I chose that quote, because we're going to be trying to tackle a pretty large subject tonight. We're trying to figure out what the Bible is, right? And we're going to approach this from a few different ways, and all ways that I think are helpful. And I think that there's a lot to be gleaned from this idea of what the Bible is. So, and just for future reference, I am going to be doing an entire series on the Bible as a whole. We're going to start from Genesis and we're going to go through the entire Bible. It's going to take, I would imagine, something like a year, maybe a year and a half, depending on how I decide to break down the chapters in each book and how much attention that I want to put on each one of them. But I hope that you can stay tuned for that. It's going to be really interesting because I think that I can offer a perspective on the Bible that might be surprising to you, or it might not be what you expect. And the philosophical implications of what the Bible reveals to us as humans, I think, are extremely significant. And even if you are not a Christian, even if you think the Bible's wacky, or if you think that it's goofy and silly, or if you think that, some bearded men in a smoky room in antiquity convened together to conspire to manipulate people into believing it, even if you believe all those things, there is still something to be gained philosophically from what the Bible reveals about human nature and about what it means to be human. Okay, so tune in for that. I'll probably be starting in on Genesis next month. So there's a lot of incredible stuff in Genesis that has to do with cosmology, creation, anthropology. What are humans? What are we here to do? All of those questions are addressed in the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's going to be very interesting. So I hope you can check that out. So we're going to be starting with a picture. I'm going to show you a picture, and I'm hoping that this will work on the screen, and I'll tell you in a moment why I want you to see this picture. Let's see. Now, if all goes well, you should be seeing a very famous charcoal drawing by an artist named M.C. Escher. And you probably are wondering to yourself, well, what the hell does this have to do with the Bible? And one of the main objections in modern culture to what it is that the Bible represents and what it is that it's trying to say has to do with this word in theology, which is interpretation and inspiration. Okay, so how we interpret the Bible and how we understand where it came from is going to determine what it is that we think the Bible is meant to do and where it came from. So some things in the world, and this is an idea that MC Escher tries to capture in all of his artwork. You might have seen another one he did with the stairs that always look like they're going up. And so his intention in his art was to try and encapsulate optical illusions in some sense, how something can be one and many at the same time, right? And so when we think about inspiration or how it is that the Bible came to be, what we're trying to understand is, did God write the Bible or did humans write the Bible? Okay, so some things in life are so complex that you can't say that they have a singular cause. And to me, this is very interesting because the Bible fits into this category perfectly. The Bible, we're told, was written by God. But how exactly does that play out in the world? Okay, now if God wants to reveal something to the world, he has to do it in a specific way. Or it's not that he has to do it, but that he's chosen to do it in a specific way. And that way was through the authorship of human beings. Okay, so I wanted to start with that picture. I hope that you guys are able to see that. It's very important to what I'm going to say for the rest of the evening. And so we are going to start on my notes here. These are some of the questions that we want to answer. What is the purpose of the Bible? Okay, what was it designed to do? We're not going to be dealing with whether or not God exists, all the philosophical questions that are presupposed in this talk. And the reason being is that I wanted to focus this specifically on theology. If you are not interested in theology, if you don't believe in God, I would still encourage you to stick around because you can at least learn what it is that the Bible means and what Christians believe its purpose is. So there is something for you to learn even if you don't believe in God, but we are going to presuppose the existence of God for the sake of this talk because we're coming at this from a Christian perspective, and I want to begin somewhere less complicated than that. So, what is the purpose of the Bible? How did it come to be what it is? And this is a really fascinating history that goes all the way back to before the writing of the Old Testament. And I'm going to do my best to not overdo it with the history, but there are a couple aspects of the creation of the Bible that I think are very interesting. And not only that, but pieces and texts in the Bible that actually tell us its own history. So we're going to be looking at the points in the Bible that first mention the writing of the Bible. And through that, we're going to be able to understand better what God's intention was in creating the Bible, in revealing to us his word. Okay? Can we trust what it says? Can we trust what the Bible says in terms of historicity, the implications, the anthropology, the science, possibly? You know, this is a point in modern culture. We're going to have a lot of friction between the modern materialist worldview on one hand, the scientism versus the Christianity. And my position on those things, I think, will interest you. And I think it will be helpful if you are a Christian. I'm hoping to present to you a not necessarily new, but maybe a different way of thinking about the Bible than you might have thought about it already. And how should we interact with the Bible today is the last question that I want to answer. So what is the purpose? How did it come to be what it is? Can we trust what it says? And how should we interact with it today? In other words, how should we read the Bible now? What framework, what lenses do we put on when we come to the text that are going to help us understand what it is that God is trying to reveal to us? And as we said from the beginning, we're going to be starting with the idea that in order to know what something is, you have to know what it is for. And in order to know what something is for, you have to know what it is, okay? Now, I do have some handwritten notes as well as computer notes, so we're going to be doing a little bit of bouncing back and forth, all right? So the first part that I want to address is kind of the impetus behind the creation of this video idea. Okay, so I've noticed in the few years that I've been a Christian, I spent a good amount of time in a fundamental Baptist church, which definitely revealed to me a lot of the presuppositions, I think, in both the fundamentalist and a lot actually of the modern Christian perspective about inspiration, about how the Bible was created, and just the lack of nuance in the understanding of how the Bible came to be what it is today. And I want to take a second to explain that growing up in the Christian church today, you may have been given an idea about how the Bible came to be that would be conflicting with modern scholarship, archaeological evidence, textual criticism that has been, what would you say, espoused from the halls of academia. And what's happening often, more often than I think we would really be aware, is that young folks who grew up in the church are getting into university and they're beginning to interact with different theories about the world that are contrary to their Christian worldview. And especially this point of the Bible and its inspiration. Okay, because oftentimes we can have a very simplistic understanding of how the Bible was created, and what I like to call the X-Files view of inspiration. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you take a moment to think internally how it is exactly that you imagine the Bible was written and how it came to be. Okay. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of people may have this idea that somebody like Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, woke up one morning and the Holy Spirit took him into a trance and his eyes rolled in the back of his head. And then he blacked out and wrote all these words as God took control of his body and his faculties. And then he came to when he was done and was like, whoa, look, I now have written this book of the Bible. And the reality is obviously much different than that. And the Bible itself actually tells us that reality. So we're going to look at scripture to understand where scripture came from, and we're going to use that as the basis to understand what it is that the Bible is for and what exactly the Bible is. Okay, so textual criticism, the theories of evolution, a lot of these scientific ideas, and a lot of the secular criticisms of the Bible are causing people to forsake the faith, or at the very least to have a crisis of faith, because they haven't been properly exposed to the understanding of interpretation that I think is actually in the Bible. Okay, so that's one of the things I wanted to mention. And I've also been noticing in my experience with social media that a lot of people, especially in the new age realm of thinking about spirituality, a lot of people have a very ignorant idea about how the Bible was created. And what I mean by that is, I'm talking like an Ancient Aliens History Channel idea about how the Bible was created or how it was written or how it came to be the collection of books that it is. Okay. And I would encourage you to not go to the History Channel to try and understand how the Bible came to be what it is. And the reason I say that is because you're going to hear a whole bunch of wacky things. Like there was some kind of conspiracy. A bunch of people got together and we like these books and we don't like those books. And these books suit our kind of ideological and political worldview. So we're going to keep those in the Bible. This whole idea that the councils, right, the ecumenical councils were convened with the intention of creating the canon or excluding some books and including some. And in one sense, that is true. But in the overall sense, that is very much so not true. Okay, so there's nuance, there's complexities involved in the history of the Bible. And I've seen a lot of Christians being challenged on this idea that, if you have an inquiring mind to the goings-ons of geopolitics or an understanding of spirituality, then the idea that you would believe that the Bible is this innocuous document that was organically produced throughout history, um, that would be an idea that is immature or just represents an ignorance of how the Bible was made. But in reality, the way that the Bible came to be is revealed both in the Bible and in history. And what we find, even from secular scholars and atheists that are studying textual criticism, is it's not possible for us to say that there was a conspiratorial smoky room meeting where people got together with power and influence and decided what was in the Bible. That is actually not how it happened. And so that's another spot that I want to hit and talk about a little bit. So I guess the overarching question about this whole idea is Christians, I mean, and the other, biblically or religiously textual religion somehow interacted with the world and left us with his word or with a revelation of how the world is, who he is, what he intends to do with us and the rest of the world. And this is a, if you ever just took a second to stop and think about it, it's a really interesting thing. Not many people in modern culture every Sunday are waking up in the morning, rearing to go and excited to go hear someone preach about this ancient text that is from a country halfway across the planet and written in a language that none of us genuinely speak, right? So there's something interesting going on here where there's a relationship between God and humanity, and the Bible is a product of that relationship. And so really we're asking the question, what does it mean that a text that was created by humans speaks God's word to his people? Okay? And that I think is really at the center of the issue of inspiration, and it's really going to bring us to an understanding of what the Bible is and what it's for. Okay? And as I showed you the picture, the MC Escher drawing of the hand drawing the hand, we're looking at the way the Bible came to be, and we're saying to ourselves, did God write the Bible or did humans write the Bible? Right? Was it God? Was it divine, or was it human? And the answer is yes. Yes, it was human and it's divine. And to me, when I was interacting with some of the folks who were seemingly having a crisis about how the Bible came to exist and dealing with this idea of inspiration and the fact that humans, played a very earthly role in how the scriptures came to exist, to me, that made the Bible more appealing and more interesting. I was fascinated to learn about its human history, and actually, once I realized that it wasn't the X-Files version of interpretation with someone blacking out and being possessed by God, and then all of a sudden they come to and they've written this whole book. It was fascinating to me to see that God actually intentionally and specifically chose certain people with true human feelings and emotions and histories and ideas, and was able to use them to communicate what he wanted the world to hear, his people in Israel, and then eventually the church at large that we have now. And to me, that instead of being a crisis of faith, that actually drew me into the faith further. It was a fascinating thing for me to learn. And so I realized that, having not been in the church since I was born, I was kind of a fresh canvas. So I didn't really have a lot of preconceived ideas about how the Bible works or what it was. And that was helpful in me coming to an understanding about what it is and what it means. And so there's one aspect as well about this human and divine relationship in the creation of the Bible that I find very interesting, because if you take a moment to think about what is it that we believe as Christians, what is at the very core of what it is to be a Christian, right? We believe that a human being was a divine person. And so in some sense, the idea that we have about Jesus is going to translate into the way that we see the Bible. And it's no mistake then that when John writes his gospel, that he uses the word to describe Jesus Christ. So the Logos, the word, is the Bible, And the Logos, the Word, is Jesus. And that's not by accident. It's because it's revealing to us this relationship of the two hands. You know, which hand is drawing which hand? Which hand is the cause of the other hand? And the answer is yes. Okay, so I hope that you're understanding. I'm trying to pull out of this paradox, this idea that there's a complex relationship that's actually kind of simple. We could call it simplex. It's a simplex relationship between God and humanity that's at the root of how the Bible came to be, but it's also at the root of who Jesus was and who he is. Okay? And so I want to start by saying what the Bible is not. Okay? The Bible is not a divine behavior manual dropped out of the sky. Now, what do I mean by that? If you have been a Christian for any period of time, you would have come across people at some point who, if you don't think that way about what the Bible is, certainly some Christian brothers and sisters do think about it this way. And I would say a good majority of the people outside of the faith believe that the point of the Bible is to give you a list of rules and behaviors that you have to follow in order to go to the good place when you die. Okay? So it's a book, it's a behavior manual, it's a list of the things that you have to do and the things that you have to not do. And then at the end of the story, you get to go to heaven or you go to hell. Now, the Bible does have heaven and hell in it, but what I'm trying to say is that the purpose of the Bible, the thing that it's for, is not that. It's not a divine behavior manual, okay? Now, what we already mentioned, that the authors of the Bible were not inspired X-Files style. It wasn't a channel. I mean, there may be instances of that in some sense, but when we look to the scriptures, that's not what we find there. And the Bible is certainly not the product of powerful people making an attempt at manipulating and brainwashing the ignorant masses. Now, you would be surprised how prevalent that idea is. Now, I don't know if it's just because of my past and where I've come from, but it seems to me that the majority opinion in the younger millennial and younger atheist, or just I'm not religious but I'm spiritual kind of folks today in modern culture, they really do believe that the Bible was the product of a conspiracy, you know, in order to manipulate people and to dumb them down or to control them or to deceive them. And to be honest, I felt that way at one point too, when I was a kind of a vague spiritualist and New Age believer. That is really what I believe too. I saw Christianity as kind of an ignorant, a coping mechanism for people who couldn't see the world for what it is. It was like a belief system that told them what to do instead of allowed them to be themselves or be free and make their own decisions. Okay. I saw it as some kind of obedience generating rule machine. And that is common today still. I notice now, being on the other side of the fence and looking back at what I believed before. And so we're going to do a little bit to dispel that idea, this myth that, somebody, paid Constantine to develop the Bible, or that these councils got together and conspiratorially developed what we have as the scriptures today. So all of that to say, we're going to get into, I think the best way to kind of jump into this issue and try and understand what the Bible is to look and see what the Bible says, right? And so the what we're going to do is we're going to do bookends. So we're going to look at the first 3 words in Genesis. If you're not familiar with the Bible, Genesis is the first book of the Bible. It contains in it the creation, the story of creation. It has the creation of the whole universe. It has the creation of mankind. It has the paradise beginning of the human origins. And we're going to be doing a whole stream just on creation later on as we get into Genesis. So the first 3 words of Genesis, which you probably know if you've read it at all, are in the beginning, right? And then we're going to fast forward all the way to the bookend, and Revelation is the very last book of the Bible. And we're going to look at not the exact last words, because there's kind of an epilogue at the end of Revelation, a little commentary, but the end of what I would say is the meat of Revelation. And that sentence goes like this: and they will reign forever and ever. Now, I want you to think to yourself, what kind of book begins with "in the beginning" and then ends "and they will reign forever and ever"? Okay? Think about what kind of book that is. It certainly is not a divine behavior manual. It is definitely not an obedience generating rule machine, right? It's a story. That's what it is. That's how stories begin and end. Now, careful. What I'm not saying is that the story of the Bible is a myth, or that it's somehow an imagined worldview. It's not a myth in the general sense that we would understand myth today, but it is a myth in the sense that it would have been historically understood, which is actually a interpretation of historical events that were real. Okay, because the point of myths originally was to capture the true historical events and contextualize them into a narrative that made sense to the people who were hearing the story. All right. And so in some sense, now I'm being careful when I use the term myth. You have to understand there's a qualification here. In some sense, the Bible is an epic. It's an epic kind of myth. Okay. Now, what's interesting about the Bible and what sets it apart, in my opinion, from the other religious myths is that something about Jesus becoming incarnate, the myth, what would normally be the myth or the cosmology or the imagination, the story that was imagined about the world, has broken into reality. So in some sense, in Jesus, that the root of what it means to make a story and where meaning comes from has become incarnate and lived as an actual person. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more, but to me, that is a really fascinating way of looking at the Bible. In the beginning, and they will reign forever and ever. Okay, it sounds like a fairy tale. And so now we're going to look at what the Bible is for. Okay, so let's do this. We're going to look at, well, actually, let's look at Exodus. We're going to start with Exodus. So now the trivia question would be, where in the Bible is the first mentioning of the Bible being created? It's a good trivia question for the Christians out there. I'll let you think about it for a second. You can Google it, obviously, but think about where it is that you hear about the Bible being written for the first time in the Bible. It's pretty anticlimactic, but it's actually in Exodus. Okay, so we're gonna look at what the story says, and if I'm not mistaken, it is Exodus 17, 8 and 9. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time reading through all this stuff, but I want to give you an idea of what it is that I'm trying to say. Okay, so it says, now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for yourself some mighty men and go out and set the army in array against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and set the army in array against Amalek. Then Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was, when Moses held up his hands, that Israel prevailed. But when he let down his hands, Amalek prevailed. Now Moses' hands became heavy. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, and on one side stood one and on the other, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Now listen to this. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. So, kind of anticlimactic, right? Not a lot of, not a lot of supernatural stuff going on. Moses's eyes didn't roll in the back of his head, and he didn't have a seizure or spaz out. It's a really simple, just God tells Moses, write this down so that you can remember what I did. And now in some sense, we're getting slightly into what the purpose of the Bible is, okay? We've already said it's a story. It's a true story, but it is a story nonetheless. But what does the story do? The purpose of the story is for us to remember what God has done. Now, God uses more than one strategy when it comes to causing people to remember what he's done. And what do you think the other strategy is that he uses? I'll give you a moment to think about what besides the Bible has God given to the world in order to remember his love and what he's done to create a special people in the world. It's a meal, right? Earlier on in Exodus, the ritual meal, where each food means something specific and special, the meal was used as a tactile and visceral way of causing the story of what God did in freeing the Israelites from Egypt, right? That meal, that symbolic ritual meal, was used to tell a story, okay? And so what you can probably understand now, what I'm trying to emphasize is that there's an aspect of story involved in this that's very important, okay? God didn't rescue the Israelites out of Egypt in order to tell them, you need to do this so that you can go to heaven. That's not what's going on here. There's a bigger picture. Now, that isn't not a part of the story. Of course, we get as we go further on in the story, we get to learn more about what it is that God's intentions are, right? There's a progressive revelation. But I wanted you to hear the first time in the Bible that the writing of the Bible is mentioned. The second time it's mentioned is Exodus 24. Now, I won't read as much of this one, but just so you can get an idea. It's Exodus 24:3. So Moses came and told the people all the words of God and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words the Lord spoke we will do. Then Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 stones according to the 12 tribes of Israel. That's the second time that the writing of the Bible is mentioned in the Bible. Now, very uneventful, very anticlimactic. There's no thunder and, possession and channeling and chants and prayers. It's a very simple. Moses wrote down the words of God. Okay. Now, why does this matter? Because what I'm trying to point out to you is that the purpose of the Bible is, in my opinion, it's much greater and much more interesting than just simply giving people a list of rules that they have to obey. Right? So what is really the point? This is what I'm getting at, okay? So God reveals himself to the world with the intention of both saving and drawing apart a special people that he then invites to participate in a covenant relationship with him, with the intention, right, of causing them to live in a different way than the rest of the world. And we're going to see how that kind of story continues into the New Testament from the Old Testament, right? And that's really, just simply put, that is what the Bible is. It is a story about God saving a people, separating them in a special way, and then covenanting with them, developing a special relationship so that they then can be his emissaries and reach out to the rest of the world and invite the rest of the world to participate in that same relationship that they share with God. Now, does Israel do a good job? Absolutely not. They do an utterly devastating job at this. They're very, very poor. But I'm trying to point out that there's this emphasis on story, on covenant, on relationship, on an intimacy with God and his revelation that you don't get if the way you see the Bible and its purpose is, I need to go to the good place when I die. Okay. There's a huge and wide world of meaning beyond just that simplistic way of looking at the Bible. And now you may not think that as a Christian if you're listening to this, or as a not Christian even, but a lot of people who both are and aren't Christians have this very simple understanding of the Bible. And that's kind of the purpose of me doing this video, is I want to expose you to what I would consider a more intimate and interesting way of understanding the scripture. Now, we're going to move on to, so I want to say a little bit about, I guess we've kind of covered what it is, but I want to say one more thing. And I think this is helpful, especially for modern people in thinking about what the Bible is. So the name of the stream is What is the Bible? All right. And what the Bible is it's a technology that tells a story. And the story is really about what God has done throughout history to save and form a people. And then to invite those people into a relationship, and then the result of that being that these people will live under a completely new and different worldview, and with the intention of mediating God's blessing that they've received from God to other people so that they can receive the same blessing. Okay, and if you look through the Old Testament, if you look through the story of Abraham, this story runs right straight through the entire Old Testament into the New Testament, and ultimately through the actions and revelations of Christ brings the church into this same level of understanding. Now, interestingly enough, today we have the really crazy stuff going on in Israel with Palestine. And I saw on social media pretty much directly after this happened, I would consider it kind of the neo Christian conservatives were very excited to basically just say we need to bomb Palestine into the Stone Age, and the only way to respond. And there's a lot of this really weird cultish kind of idea about Israel being still this physical body of land. Now, when God set apart Israel, it was the spiritual relationship that he shared with those people that made them unique. And if you read the New Testament carefully, there is no doubt that the Israel of the modern world is the church. It's no longer a piece of land, and it's no longer just some sort of geography. It's the actual living spirit inhabiting body of Christ, which is the church. And I just find it, this story, this way that we are interpreting the Bible and understanding what it is now, would prevent, I think, a lot of people from getting caught into this idea where if we're Christian, then we need to support Israel going to war with Palestine and killing innocent people. Now, there's people on both sides of this it's devastating. Obviously, there's violence. None of it is good. But it was interesting for me to see the knee-jerk reaction on behalf of some of the people in the West to just blindly say that, Israel is going to be justified in doing whatever it is that they do next, which I can tell you, understanding geopolitics as I do, that situation is not going to turn out good. Not for anybody involved. It's really, really bad news. But it was interesting that the story of the Bible that we're talking about tonight would have offered maybe a different way of interpreting those events and trying to understand what the significance of Israel is, both as a people, the location, and as the church. And so, what is the Bible for? We've kind of talked about what the Bible is. Now, what is it for? Because we need to understand both those things to really understand what the Bible is. So the Bible is, oh yeah, spicy take, but I like it. Yeah, man. I think that the geopolitical situation is something that really benefits, I think, from a biblically informed but also philosophically savvy understanding. And just, man, the knee-jerk reaction on social media for calling for violence and retaliation to me just seemed really scripted. It seemed very suspicious. It was like, all the way people from Jordan Peterson to Dan Bongino and all these people. It was like immediately, yeah, Israel needs to strike back with force. I mean, including Trump. And so to me, that's just an unfortunate understanding that Christians have about our relationship to the Bible, that can actually get all the way to the point where people believe that it would be good to try and pursue the Jews building the third temple, because they actually believe that in doing that, they're initiating a sequence of events that brings about the end times. And I'm saying that's like at the extreme of it, but you'd be surprised to find out how common that is. That is a real seriously held belief. And to me, that's just, it's not only a poor political stance, but it's a really poor understanding of what the Bible is trying to say about Israel. And I think if you read the New Testament carefully, it would be difficult to come down with that conclusion. So we know what the Bible is. It's a story. It's a story that reveals God's intention to save, to redeem is probably the more biblical term, and to set apart a specific people so that they can live a different way, and then offer that same relationship that they have with God to other people, that they can then enjoy that relationship as well. And what it's for, in my understanding, what we see revealed both in the Old Testament and then into the New Testament with Christ, is that God is offering to the world a new way of being. It's really presenting to you through the form of story and narrative a new philosophy, a new way of looking at everything. And when I say worldview, I mean everything from how you think about your family, how you think about strangers, how you think about food, how you think about homes. It just literally an utterly different worldview. And God tries to work this out through the rigmaroles of human complexity. And I think what the Bible is for, when we're really trying to answer what the Bible's for, it is really for offering this new worldview through the form of story and narrative. And I think that when you look at the Old Testament, you actually get, well, I'm going to save we're going to go through each book kind of quickly and get a little bit more of a detailed perspective on what it is. But in conclusion, what you can take away is it's a simplex thing. It's simple but complex, but the Bible is ultimately telling you a story that invites you into this special relationship with God and his people, and offers to you and delivers, I think, in this offering, a new worldview that not only improves the way that you experience the world and the way that you treat people, but actually is the correct way of looking at the world. And the reason why I say I think it's the correct way is because if we presuppose the existence of God, which we're doing for the sake of this conversation, how is it that we would come to know anything about the world, anything significant? I'm talking like ultimate truth, something that genuinely is the way reality exists. Now, in order for us to know if something is true or false, we would have to know everything, right? We would literally have to have complete and total knowledge. Otherwise, we would never be able to know for sure if we were deceiving ourselves or if we were maybe experiencing a coincidence, right? So the possibility of knowledge is predicated on God's revelation to us, right? If God created us, if God is the creator of heaven and earth, which the Bible claims and which I believe is true, then we would expect that he would reveal what the meaning and purpose of his creation is. And I think that's exactly what we have in the Bible. And it really adds a little bit to what I think it's for. It's genuinely to give direction and to give understanding and to give the possibility of understanding the world correctly. Now, you may know some things here and there, and we can even discover things with science. But what I'm saying is that all of those discoveries and the way that worldview works, it actually presupposes, without acknowledging, the existence of this basis and fundamental truth, which makes all other truth possible, makes the world intelligible as a whole. And so if we don't have this understanding about the world, we're actually not seeing the world for what it is. And if we don't see the world for what it is, just like if we don't see the Bible for what it is, it's really not possible for us to build cultures and to build civilizations and relationships in a way that's running along the grain of reality. Anything that operates against the grain of reality is only going to create turmoil and tension and ultimately violence, like what we see in the Middle East today. And so there is a correct way of looking at the world. And I think that we would expect, if we believe in a God, that he would reveal to us what that correct way is, or at the very least, which I think the Bible does, is give us the wisdom and the presuppositions and the preconditions for coming to understand those things. So that, in my opinion, is what the Bible is for. And I know I said that it's for a lot of things, but I believe all those things are true. And so now I want to talk a little bit about about what the Bible is, literally. Like, what is the Bible as you hold it in your hand? And I won't take up too much more time. We've got, if you haven't, I'm sure that you probably have if you're living in the United States, but if you're seeing this from another place and you've never actually picked up a Bible, you might know, even if you've never picked one up, you immediately open up and you're confronted actually with a series of books. So technically the Bible is a miniature library. It's actually a book that contains multiple books. And then you'll see actually in those lists of multiple books, there's two kind of mini libraries that contain a group of books in the first and a group of books in the second. And there's a whole interesting history and backstory, which I will be going in depth, kind of more into the historical details later on. But just quickly, I wanted to just give you kind of the crash course in, what the Old Testament is, and then a little bit about the New Testament. So the Hebrew Bible is often called the Tanakh, and that is a kind of Hebrew acronym. And the first book, which is called the Torah, and you probably would have heard the word Torah before in, just in passing in culture, but the word Torah actually means teaching and instruction. So you have in the Hebrew Bible, the books of the Torah are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the modern version of the Bible is going to be a little bit different than how the Hebrew Bible was actually handed down. And those differences are important, which I'm about to show you. And then the second groups of books in the Hebrew Bible are the Nevi'im, which is equal to the prophets. So in the Nevi'im, in the Hebrew Bible, you have Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of 12, which is actually kind of a compilation of what we would nowadays call the minor prophets. And that is from Hosea and Malachi. And so we have what I think is interesting is the books that we would normally consider historical are actually contained in the Hebrew Bible as prophets. And this is really important because we're trying to discuss what the Bible is for. And when we see that the Hebrew Bible has historical books inside of what they call the prophets, the prophetic texts, we might ask ourselves, well, that seems kind of contrary to what we might imagine as a modern human approaching the Bible, because we have our historical books, we have our prophetic books, and we kind of keep those in neat categories. But what is that trying to tell us? Well, if we think of the Bible in terms of a story, not that it isn't true, not that it's made up, it's historically true, but that it's trying to communicate meaning through the literary device of narrative. It's trying to give us a picture of the world. And why would they include the prophets and why would they include the historical books in the prophets? Well, in the prophetic worldview, in the biblical worldview of the authors of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets are offering in their history, they're offering you a prophetic interpretation of the history of Israel. Okay, so, and this is really important because in some sense the historical narratives of the Bible are presented this way. And so if you're opening the Hebrew Bible and you're going to look for, well, what happened at this date and this time, they're going to tell you to go to the history books. But if you're trying to find the meaning of events that happen in history, they're going to tell you you have to go and see the prophets. You see, the prophets were the communicators of the story. They were taking the historical events that were happening to Israel and contextualizing them and framing them inside of an understanding of the narrative of the Bible and the way that God revealed himself and decided to interact with the world. Okay. So that's really interesting to me, and I thought you'd find it interesting as well. And then we have the third kind of amalgamation of books in the Hebrew Bible is the Ketuvim, which is just called the writings. And that's where you find Psalms, Job, Proverbs. You have Ruth in there, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And so this is kind of a hodgepodge of poetry, of prose, of narrative, of songs. I mean, it's a really, it's kind of the artistic interpretations of the story kind of included in that book. And so I guess we're going to transition kind of into the New Testament, but I want you to remember a few things that we want to keep in mind. The Bible is the product of both human and divine inspiration. So humans wrote the Bible, but just because we acknowledge that, it doesn't mean that we have to reject that it's divinely inspired. It's just that we're acknowledging the reality of how God worked in the world. He uniquely and specifically chose certain human beings, knowing their life's path, putting things before them that they could or couldn't overcome, allowing their free will to interact with his intentions in their lives, and produced the text that he wanted to be in the Bible. Now, this shouldn't be a scandal to your faith, because we're saying that humans, there's a real earthly interaction going on. This shouldn't be a scandal to the Christian faith. And it's something that I think actually adds more richness and intentionality in what it is that God does. And in my understanding, it's even more spectacular that through God's providence, he's able to genuinely use free will living humans to produce the word that he wants to get to his people and to the rest of the world. And so that to me is absolutely remarkable. And in the writing of the Bible, we have its very human authorship directly mentioned. So it's not as though we're going to secular scholars and saying we need to change the way we think about it, but it's just merely looking at scripture and seeing the way that it reveals itself. And so let's see. There's a whole aspect of Jeremiah that I wanted to talk about, but now it's going to take too long to get through all that. So we now need to think about what it is the story brings us to the time of Jesus. Okay. If you look at the way the story develops in the Old Testament, you have creation, you have the fall, and then the story focuses in on Abraham. Abraham becomes the kind of seed of this new people that God is going to grow throughout history. And I mean, so many things happen. Israel fails, they do good, they fail, they do good, they get kings. I mean, all of this stuff happens. And then ultimately the covenant that was originally offered to the human race by God is not repaired, right? You get to the end of the Old Testament and there seems to be no ending. There's no finale. It kind of just tapers off. And so people are expecting a prophet like Moses, but no one like Moses has come, right? And then that's when Jesus comes into the picture. And in some sense, we don't really know how this happened in terms of Jesus's experience, but Jesus is going to synagogue. He's experiencing the Bible is really just a collection of scrolls. It was rare for anyone to have the entire Hebrew Bible, but he would have heard, in different ways and in different synagogue services, these stories. And either he knew or he came to know, that these scriptures were about him. right? And so Jesus, C.S. Lewis says you can either think of him as a madman or a liar, um, but you certainly can't have an impartial reaction to Christ. The claims that Jesus makes are earth-shattering claims. They are either true or they're not true. It's no doubt that, Christians have grappled with what it means to follow Christ, and what it means for the world, for philosophy, for spirituality. All of these really profound questions come because this human being has come and claimed to be the image of God himself, to actually be a divine person, both divine and human. And so, in some sense, the Bible prepares us for that kind of thing to happen, because think about the humanity and the divinity of the Bible itself. And when John is saying that the word has become flesh, he's saying that the wisdom, what's contained, the meaning of the story and the historical implications of what the Bible said, the Hebrew Bible, has become a human being. And I think sometimes we forget that John, I mean, they were Jewish guys. They really understood and appreciated the meaning of the narrative in the Old Testament. And when Jesus comes along, they immediately make this connection. And so, what does Jesus offer the world? Jesus embodies the covenant offer that God has made with Israel as a human being. So he takes that new worldview, that new philosophy, that new way of being and looking at the world, and he lives it and teaches it in the flesh. Okay, so in some sense, the story of the Old Testament lays the foundation for Christ to then embody what the offer is that God is making to the world. And I think in my understanding, that's a really helpful way to see what the intention of the Gospels are. Okay, it's not just be good and then you go to heaven, or be bad and then you go to hell. It's something way more profound and serious, in my opinion, than that, because the implications of what it is that's happening here is that the creator, the all-powerful creator of the entire universe, has actually become a human being and is now saying to you, each individual that hears his call, you can be different. You can see the world in a new way, and God can really change your heart, and you can really live a different life. And not only that, you can make ripples in the world that affect people in a positive way. And we can actually build a culture around these ideas, around the wisdom and the incredible providence of God that we find both in the scriptures, in Jesus, and then in our daily lives as we, sit at the Bible's feet, so to speak, in the flesh of Jesus, and understand what it means and apply it in our lives. But I wanted to say a little bit about kind of what the Gospels are, and a little bit about the historicity. So, Jesus comes onto the scene. People experience what happened. We see miracles. People talk about it. Obviously, the word spreads really fast. We're talking about, small, fairly well-connected communities throughout, the Middle East. And I think one way that helped me in thinking about what the Gospels actually were, which make up the meat really of the New Testament, is that if you think about like a mosaic, and you have, well, what's a good way to approach this? Okay, let's start with this. Now, I've heard of university professors, in trying to teach people textual transmission, what they do is they set up a little game that you might have played when you were younger called telephone, right? Where everybody in kindergarten would sit in a circle, and you say one thing in one person's ear. It's like the two elephants are riding the pink bubblegum train, and then by the time you get to the other end of the circle, the phrase is completely changed, right? I've actually heard of university professors using that as a mechanism to explain how the New Testament comes to the modern world. And I'm not kidding. But that level of ignorance concerning how it is that the scriptures were compiled and brought together is absolutely inexcusable. And I'm not saying that just as a Christian and being offended of, secular criticisms of what I believe. I'm saying that genuinely as a scholar. I have a master's degree in biblical theology. I've spent a lot of time understanding textual transmission, textual criticism, and I've read a lot of the, secular scholarly work on textual transmission and where the Bible comes from. And I can tell you that that is, aside from maybe 2 scholars in the world right now, that is an incredibly unpopular and often unentertained idea. Not because people don't want to believe it, but because the manuscript evidence, the archaeological evidence, the historical evidence is way too overwhelming for anyone to believe that, a whole bunch of Jews just got together and were like, oh, we're going to change the faith of Judaism and add this guy that we're going to make up and that rose from the dead. And it's really, really, really ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. And I say that with a compassionate heart, not because I'm trying to convert people, but because I have an appreciation for good academic work, and that is just not good. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about how it is that the gospel makes its way to us. Okay. And I have a quote before we move on there. Let's do a couple bits about the Old Testament and how it got to where it is today. R.T. Beckwith, who is a secular scholar who wrote The Formation of the Hebrew Bible. This is a quote from his book when he's talking about how it is that the Hebrew Bible was made, all right, how it was formed. He says, "It is very striking that over a period ranging from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE, so many writers of so many divergent groups, Palestinian, Hellenistic, Pharisaic, Essene, and Christian, show such agreement about the canon of the Hebrew Bible. None of these witnesses are concerned with asserting the authority of the books they mention. Rather, they all assume the scripture's authority and go on to debate about their interpretation." Right? And he goes on to say, "It is clear that these groups do not speak simply for themselves, but represent Judaism as a whole. Any inference that the canon was decided by councils must be abandoned. The role of later councils was not to decide the canon, but to confirm decisions about the canon already reached in other ways." Okay? So there's a whole long, interesting textual transmission history that we don't have time to get into. But we're gonna say very quickly about the New Testament, just a couple of the scholars that I highlighted from reading over the past couple of years. Henry Gamble, in the New Testament canon in recent research, "The New Testament was not self-consciously created by the church, either as a response to external pressures or as a means to some end, but arose naturally and spontaneously from the inner life of early Christianity, above all, in context of worship and instruction." And then one more from Michael Kruger, who's also a secular scholar. "The canon was never authorized or mandated by any general council of the ancient church, but rather rested upon the early and largely informal consensus of the church. In short, the church did not, quote, close the canon because it never started it to begin with. The canon was inherited from the apostles." Okay, and I only mention those 2 quotes because I hear all the time people saying that, that the Bible is this manipulated book that was, intentionally created by power hungry, insecure men in white robes with long beards and smoky rooms. And it's just simply not true. And the scholarship represents that for sure. Absolutely. And so I think I want to say a couple more things about the New Testament, and then we can go ahead and wrap it up. So we have in the New Testament a mosaic. We just talked earlier about how the New Testament was transmitted. If you go and you read the Gospel of Luke, if you go and you check out what it is that genuinely happened, right? So you have people that were alive while Jesus was alive, people who knew him, experienced him, saw him teach. And the idea that those people then, 15 years later, now you have to keep in mind, these people's lives are hanging on their faith, right? the Jewish people at that time were deeply committed to the religious experience. They weren't just when Jesus came around and the apostles began to follow him, it wasn't like, they got to 10 years later and then got together and someone was like, oh wait, what did he say that time? I don't remember. Or somebody else, what happened was people who were there were interviewed, people exchanged what it is that they experienced. And it's out of that compilation, we have a very accurate picture of what occurred, right? Just as accurate as is possible, I would say, given the circumstances, And so is it possible that somebody misremembered something here and there? Sure, of course. But overall, the story that we have in the Gospels, what it is that Jesus did, what he said, the implications of the events that we find in Acts and the carrying out of those ideas into the wider world, is one of the most reliable bits of history that we have. And so it's very easy to have this derogatory kind of frowning upon what the biblical story represents to us in the modern world. But I want to encourage you to think a little bit more deeply and try and imagine the circumstances that the people who are involved with the writing of the Gospels would be in, right? You actually have a man who was claiming to be the incarnation of the God that your family has worshipped for generations, the whole of your race, this God that you've worshipped. This man has come and said, I'm that, right? And so for people to believe that, to take that seriously, and then to go through the trouble of writing the Gospels out and writing their version of what they saw, all of these things, it's really, really silly to just categorically deny those things because, oh, the history is not reliable. And I'll say one more thing about the textual transmission. We have more copies of the New Testament than almost any other historical document. It's absolutely shocking how many copies of the New Testament we have, how much manuscript evidence there is, right? And I always point this out to people because I find it interesting. Nobody questions the existence of Plato, right? If you talk to any scholar in the halls of academia about Plato and you're like, hey, was Plato actually a real person? Now there might be some kooks who are like, well, maybe not. And they might be writing a paper about it, but overall, the majority of people are going to agree that Plato existed, right? Now we have less than 10 manuscripts of all of Plato's work, right? There's 5,000 to 6,000 New Testament documents, right? And this type of historical evidence would normally be accepted without question. But because the information that believing in that historical evidence represents, the implications of it are so vast that people have spent, hundreds and hundreds of years trying to reject the reality of what they say. And so if you're listening to this and you're curious about Christianity, I would encourage you to reach out. I'm always available through social media or here on YouTube. And I just want to conclude by saying when we hold the Bible in our hands, we're not experiencing we're not experiencing an authoritarian God who's given us a book of rules that we have to follow so that we can go and be obedient for eternity. All right. That is absolutely not what the Bible is. What it is a really profound historical narrative that interprets the world in a way that's different than you do now, right? And I would encourage you to expose yourself to it with an open mind, talk to people who know the Bible, or get one yourself and begin reading it, and start to think, what is it, if there is this God who has intentionally moved the hearts and minds of men and women to create this story for me to read now, and has providentially brought it all the way down the road of history to this present moment, what is it that he is trying to say? What is the meaning of all this? And I think when you look at the Bible as a whole, when you look at the story, when you look at the Old and the New Testament and the way that Jesus relates to what the Bible is, when you take all of this into account, I think really what we have at the end of the day is that God loves the world he intended to give us a world where instead of choosing between good and evil, we would have the free will choice between good and lesser goods. Okay. He really wanted to offer us a world where heaven and earth were united. And what the Bible is an explanation of how it is that we've gotten to where we are today in terms of philosophy, spirituality, and anthropology, and all of that. It's an explanation for why the world is the way that it is. And what it's for is to call you, the person who's seeing this now, into a relationship with him so that you can become one of the people that are his emissaries, that image his nature and character and share that with the people around you, with the intention of, at the end of time, reuniting heaven and earth again in a new creation where we can actually accomplish what it is that God created us to do. And that's what I think the Bible is for. And that's what I think the Bible is. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned some things. And as I said, I'm always open to questions and comments. So please reach out when you have a moment. And I hope I will see you next time. Next week, we're going to be going back to philosophy for the week. And then the week following that, we're probably going to start getting into Genesis. So I've got to work out how I want to break that down and what will be the best way to do it. So God bless you guys for being here.
Thanks for tuning into the show, everybody. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our sponsors and show them some love. We really appreciate them, and we really appreciate you appreciating them. So check out all the links in the description and come on back next week for some more. Thanks a lot.